The morning sky over the Pacific shimmered with heat and mist, a curtain of humidity that clung to the air like a living thing. The island of Ricotta lay barely visible through the low clouds, a forgotten speck on naval maps, its dense jungle swallowing cliffs and beaches alike. For months, the island had gone unnoticed in the chaos of the wider war. Yet for the handful of American soldiers who had been left behind, it was a prison, a battleground, and a home all at once. Corporal James Holden, 23, leaned against a fallen palm tree and watched the ocean roll toward the shore. His uniform, once crisp and khaki, was now tattered and patched with whatever cloth he could scavenge. His skin was sunburned, his hands scarred from the relentless brush of thorns and coral reefs. Around him, the remnants of his unit, 10 men in total, moved quietly through the jungle, listening for the faintest signs of Japanese patrols or wild animals. Food had grown scarce, and each day was a struggle between hope and despair. They had been left behind during a naval bombardment in late 1943, their naval extraction ship destroyed by a hidden reef while evading Japanese artillery. The Navy had assumed the soldiers drowned or had been captured, and the map of their mission was crossed out, their names erased from official records. But Holden and his comrades had survived, forced to adapt to a harsh island environment while avoiding discovery. Water from the stream they relied upon was tainted with silt, the jungle dense and teeming with unknown predators. Each morning they scavenged for coconuts, fish, and the occasional bird. Hunting required stealth. The slightest noise could alert enemy scouts, and the Japanese garrison on the island was rumored to be brutal and unforgiving. Yet despite the terror, there was a camaraderie born of necessity. The soldiers moved as one, whispering strategies, sharing rations, telling stories of home to remind themselves that the world beyond the island still existed. Holden crouched beside Private First Class Leonard Briggs, inspecting a trap they had set the night before. Briggs, only 19, had enlisted straight out of high school, and the island had aged him beyond his years. "Nothing yet," Holden muttered, adjusting the snare. They had learned quickly. Patience was survival, and impatience often meant death. The sun rose higher, burning through the thick canopy, illuminating the remains of a Japanese patrol that had passed too close to their camp the previous day. A tattered flag hung from a palm frond, a silent reminder of the enemy's presence. The men moved cautiously, checking their perimeter, knowing that one wrong step could bring bullets, bayonets, or worse. Nightfall brought temporary relief from the heat, but introduced another set of dangers. The sounds of the jungle became a symphony of whispers, shrieks, and rustling that could mask an approaching soldier or predator. The men huddled together, whispering plans, sharing stories to keep fear at bay. Holden often found himself staring at the stars, thinking of Ohio, of his mother's kitchen, of letters never sent, and the life that existed before the island swallowed them whole. The first enemy encounter came on a humid afternoon when a small Japanese patrol stumbled across their hiding spot while scouting for survivors or escapees. The Americans had anticipated the patrol and retreated silently through a narrow ravine, the foliage so thick that it masked their passage. Bullets whizzed past, striking trees and soil, but none found the men. By the time the patrol moved on, Holden and his comrades were miles away, their sweat and exhaustion mixing with the mud that covered them from head to toe. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Each day Holden marked time with tally scratches on the inside of a coconut shell, the only measure of the passage of life on the island. Rumors of rescue floated occasionally, planes overhead, ships sighted on the horizon, but none stopped. The isolation was profound, and with each sunrise, the men felt increasingly like phantoms, remnants of a war that had moved on without them. Food shortages became critical. The men adapted, learning which plants were safe to eat, which roots could sustain them, and how to fish without attracting attention. They constructed hidden shelters deep in the jungle, camouflaged against aerial reconnaissance, and devised warning systems using natural signals, branches, rocks, and even the calls of native birds. Every survival tactic was refined through trial and error, each lesson paid for in exhaustion and near misses. The psychological toll was immense. Holden and Briggs argued silently, tensions fraying nerves already taut with fear. Dreams of rescue mingled with hallucinations, phantom voices calling from the treetops, the sounds of past firefights echoing through the foliage. They spoke little, but their eyes told the story of men stretched to their limits, holding on to life by threadbare strands of courage and stubborn hope. One day, while scouting along a cliff that overlooked the shoreline, Holden spotted a glint in the water far below. A ship? He motioned to Briggs. They waited, hidden in the mangroves, watching as a supply barge passed, oblivious to the men camouflaged above. The sight rekindled hope, but it was fleeting. The enemy's presence remained, the island's treacherous terrain was unforgiving, and the soldiers knew they were trapped by circumstance and geography alike. The narrative of the forgotten island had only just begun. Each day was a battle for survival, each night a confrontation with the unseen, but the men refused to give up. They were soldiers, trained to endure, to resist, to survive against all odds. And as Holden traced the coastline with his eyes, imagining escape or rescue, he vowed that if they survived, the world would know their story. The story of the Americans left behind, the soldiers who fought on an island that time itself seemed to have forgotten.
The weeks stretched into months, and the island's oppressive humidity pressed down on the men with relentless insistence. The once hopeful light of rescue had dimmed into a steady, gnawing awareness. They were entirely alone, survivors of a forgotten misstep in the vast Pacific theater. The thick canopy of trees above filtered the sun into dim green, dappled patterns on the forest floor. Yet the beauty was deceptive. Each shadow could conceal snakes, crocodiles, or enemy patrols. Corporal James Holden and his small group had learned to move silently, leaving no trail that could betray them. Each day began with a reconnaissance of the surrounding area, noting fresh tracks, listening for distant voices, and cataloging sources of water. Streams ran murky with sediment, sometimes teeming with small fish or crustaceans that could be caught if patience allowed. The men improvised traps from bamboo, vines, and stones. These rudimentary devices sustained them. But hunger and malnutrition were constant companions, gnawing at both body and spirit. Private Leonard Briggs had grown gaunt, his youthful features hollowed by months of deprivation. Yet he remained alert, always the first to scout a path or listen for approaching danger. He had begun keeping a mental map of the island, plotting safe routes between fresh water sources and edible plants. The jungle, once alien and threatening, had become a terrain he could navigate almost instinctively. Conflict arose not only from the environment, but also from the strain of constant survival. Tensions flared as rations dwindled, and small mistakes could escalate into dangerous disagreements. One morning, Holden found Briggs attempting to climb a tree to retrieve coconuts without warning the rest of the group. The noise drew a nearby Japanese patrol into the vicinity, forcing the men to hide in the undergrowth until the danger passed. When it was over, the two argued fiercely, the stress of isolation manifesting in anger and frustration. But by nightfall, the bond that had kept them alive, camaraderie forged in fire, reasserted itself. The Japanese presence on the island was relentless. Occasional patrols scoured the jungle, often leaving behind traps or signs of brutality meant to dissuade any hidden Americans. Once, Holden's group discovered a shallow grave containing the remains of two locals, a grim warning that the island's inhabitants lived under fear as absolute as their own. This knowledge reinforced the soldiers' caution. Every path was assessed twice, every sound interpreted as a potential threat, and every decision weighed against the cost of discovery. Water remained a precious commodity. The men built rain catchments from banana leaves and hollowed logs, filtering water through layers of cloth and sand. Each sip was measured, rationed to preserve life, yet the need for hydration never diminished. Malaria and other tropical diseases stalked them silently, taking advantage of weakened bodies. Holden had learned to recognize the subtle signs of fever, the trembling hands, the glazed eyes, and the weakness in the step. In such moments, the line between life and death felt almost arbitrary. Food was equally scarce. The island's wildlife had adapted to the humans who had long since been presumed gone. Fish were wary, birds suspicious, and small mammals disappeared quickly once traps were set. The men became hunters, their skills honed through trial and error. Spears were sharpened with stones, snares hidden among foliage, and patience became their greatest weapon. Occasionally they managed to catch a fish or bird, roasting it over small fires constructed to produce minimal smoke. But these victories were rare, fleeting, and never sufficient to end the gnawing hunger. Despite the physical challenges, the soldiers faced psychological trials that tested their endurance. Dreams of home, hallucinations of unseen threats, and the omnipresent fear of discovery made the nights interminable. Some nights, Holden imagined ships approaching the shore, only to see distant flashes of lightning reveal empty horizons. These visions alternated with nightmares, recalling the missions that had brought them here, the friends who had been lost, and the endless silence that now defined their existence. Communication with the outside world had been severed completely. The radios salvaged from their initial landing had been destroyed in a storm, leaving them to rely solely on visual signals or smoke in emergencies. Yet the threat of discovery made these methods too dangerous. Isolation became their constant companion, shaping each decision, each step through the unforgiving jungle. As months passed, the soldiers' routines became ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Dawn brought scouting, midday brought the search for food and water, and evening brought the construction of hidden shelters to evade night patrols. Trees were used as cover and climbing points, vines as cordage. They learned which plants were edible, which roots were poisonous, and which fruits could provide hydration. Every day required meticulous planning, for one mistake could expose them to the enemy or the jungle itself. The first serious encounter with Japanese patrols occurred in the 6th month. Holden's group was moving along a ridge overlooking the south coast when they spotted movement below. 10 soldiers in olive drab, armed and alert. Holden froze, whispering commands that allowed the men to melt into the foliage like shadows. The patrol lingered, seemingly sensing something but never fully detecting them. That night, the group huddled together in silence, adrenaline still surging, the fear of capture pressing like a physical weight. Weeks later, Holden observed the effects of prolonged isolation on his men. Mental strain manifested in paranoia, mistrust, and frayed nerves. Arguments erupted over rations, routes, and the smallest perceived slights. But these moments of tension were balanced by acts of courage and selflessness. Briggs would sometimes forego his portion of food to ensure others had enough. Another soldier, Private Daniels, took on the most dangerous scouting missions alone, returning with crucial information about enemy movements or potential shelter sites. One morning, Holden discovered evidence of a previous skirmish on the island. Spent cartridges, broken equipment, and signs of struggle, but no bodies. The Japanese presence had been more aggressive than anticipated, and the soldiers now realized the full extent of their vulnerability. They redoubled their caution, setting up lookout points and silent alarm systems using natural indicators, snapped twigs, disturbed leaves, and animal movement. Natural hazards were as dangerous as the enemy. Sudden tropical storms flooded paths, washed out shelters, and destroyed food caches. Snakes, spiders, and other predators lurked in the underbrush. Holden became adept at reading the environment, predicting weather patterns, and identifying safe routes through the island. Each survival decision required balance, foresight, and nerve, as a single misstep could result in injury or death. By the end of the first year, the soldiers had established a fragile routine. They knew which parts of the island were safer, which areas to avoid, and how to ration supplies effectively. Yet despite adaptation, the psychological toll remained immense. Hope persisted in small measures: sightings of distant ships, flashes of Allied aircraft overhead, and the occasional drift of news from other islands. But rescue always seemed just out of reach. The narrative of the forgotten island was one of endurance, fear, and adaptation. Holden and his comrades existed in a state of constant alertness, their survival dependent on skill, courage, and the ability to anticipate threats both seen and unseen. Every day was a negotiation between life and death, every decision potentially fatal. Yet amidst the struggle, a profound sense of camaraderie emerged, binding the men together in ways that transcended ordinary friendship. As Holden climbed a ridge to survey the coast, he glimpsed the horizon where sky met sea. A faint outline of a ship appeared, distant and fleeting. The heart quickened, but as the morning light brightened, it vanished. Still, the sight ignited determination. They would survive. They must survive. And if they did, the world would hear the story of the soldiers left behind, of the men who fought and endured on an island the war had forgotten. The following weeks were a relentless test of endurance. Every morning, Holden and his comrades awoke to the oppressive heat and the cacophony of the jungle. Birds screamed from the canopy, monkeys leapt through the trees, and insects swarmed in clouds that clung to exposed skin. Each step required vigilance. The slightest miscalculation could result in a venomous bite or a fall into hidden ravines. Yet the soldiers pressed on, learning the language of the island. Which plants signaled the presence of water, which birds indicated food nearby, and which insects heralded danger. Rations remained meager. A single coconut might sustain 2 men for a day, and fish were
The second year on the island had hardened the soldiers, yet the gnawing desire for escape never left them. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a boundless expanse of blue that mocked their isolation. Holden studied the horizon each morning, searching for ships, planes, any sign that the world beyond the island still existed. Occasionally, the faint silhouette of a naval vessel appeared, only to vanish into the haze. These glimpses reignited hope and despair in equal measure. One morning, Holden gathered the men. "We need a plan," he said, voice steady though his mind raced. "We can't wait here forever." They debated potential escape routes, the cliffs to the north, the hidden coves to the south, the reefs that might allow them to build rafts. Each option carried deadly risks. Currents were treacherous, reefs sharp enough to rip hulls apart, and Japanese patrols constant along the coast. Yet the men knew inaction was a death sentence by attrition. Starvation, disease, or discovery would eventually claim them if they remained. Weeks of preparation followed. They scavenged bamboo, vines, and driftwood, constructing rafts in secret, hidden by dense foliage. The work was grueling, the material scarce, and every moment outside the jungle's protective canopy exposed them to the risk of patrols. Briggs, whose youthful energy had waned under the stress of isolation, proved invaluable, tying knots, assembling rafts, and scouting supply lines. Daniels, quiet and methodical, ensured that each structure could float and carry their limited provisions. The night of the first escape attempt arrived under a crescent moon. The ocean was calm, deceptively serene, and the men slipped silently toward the northern shore. Every sound, a snapping twig, a whisper of wind, a distant call of a night bird, was amplified in their heightened awareness. The first raft pushed into the water, holding Holden and Briggs, each movement calculated. The currents tugged at the fragile structure, and the men paddled slowly, testing the buoyancy and endurance of their creation. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The moon sank behind clouds, leaving the men in near darkness, guided only by memory and instinct. Waves lapped against the sides of the raft, threatening to capsize them with each sudden swell. Their ears strained for distant sounds, anything that might indicate patrols or, worse, enemy ships. Yet the night remained eerily silent, as if the ocean itself conspired to hide them. Suddenly, a distant light flickered across the water. Holden froze, heart hammering, straining to determine its origin. Japanese searchlights? Another patrol boat? The raft drifted closer to the source, currents carrying them inexorably toward danger. In a heartbeat, Holden realized it was a reflection off a natural reef catching the moonlight in a cruel trick of perception. Relief flooded through him, but the reminder was clear. Survival required vigilance without lapse. The first attempt failed in practical terms. The rafts were too fragile to traverse the full distance to Allied-held territory. Currents swept them back to the shore, soaked and exhausted. Yet the experience proved invaluable. They had learned the limits of their materials, the behavior of the tides, and the necessity of careful timing. A second, more ambitious attempt was planned, this time with larger rafts and more provisions. While escape occupied their thoughts, the Japanese presence grew increasingly threatening. Patrols had begun to carry more sophisticated detection equipment, tripwires, flares, and observation posts. Holden's group became shadows, traveling only under cover of dense foliage or after storms when visibility was low. They avoided predictable patterns, varied paths, and moved silently like ghosts through the jungle. Yet each patrol encounter reminded them that one misstep could end everything. Disease struck again. Briggs fell ill with a fever that left him delirious for days. Holden administered rudimentary treatment: boiled water, crushed leaves, and careful attention to hydration. Daniels remained vigilant, ensuring Briggs did not succumb to exhaustion. The illness slowed preparations for escape, but it also strengthened their resolve. Survival was a collective effort. Every life mattered, and every action had to be precise. A breakthrough came in the form of an abandoned Japanese rowboat hidden in a secluded cove. Its hull was cracked but repairable. Using bamboo and vines, the men reinforced the vessel, planning to combine it with one of their rafts to create a hybrid capable of withstanding longer stretches of open ocean. The men worked in secret, using the cover of darkness, and for the first time, hope felt tangible. The next attempt at escape involved both ingenuity and desperation. Holden, Briggs, Daniels, and the remaining men launched the hybrid craft under the cover of an early storm. Waves tossed the vessel violently, rain lashed their faces, and lightning illuminated the sea in brief, blinding flashes. Each man gripped the makeshift oars with every ounce of strength, aware that failure meant immediate death, either from drowning or the inevitable discovery by Japanese forces. Hours passed in a blur of exertion and fear. Exhaustion pressed down on their bodies, muscles screaming, lungs burning with each stroke. The hybrid raft held, barely, and currents carried them gradually farther from the island. Holden's mind oscillated between hope and despair, envisioning rescue, imagining the taste of fresh bread, the sight of friendly faces, the embrace of freedom. Yet each wave reminded him of the fragility of their endeavor, the narrow margin between survival and oblivion. They were discovered. A Japanese patrol, alerted by some unknown source, perhaps a distant reflection of moonlight off the water, spotted their movement. Bullets tore into the water around them, splinters of wood flying, the sound of metal ricocheting against the raft like thunder. The men ducked and paddled frantically, ignoring wounds and exhaustion. By some miracle, the storm and the skillful navigation of Holden and Daniels allowed them to evade immediate capture, drifting into darkness until the sound of pursuit faded. The ordeal left them battered and soaked, but alive. For the first time, they realized the possibility of survival beyond the island. The hybrid raft had proven capable, the men had learned to maneuver under extreme conditions, and the bond between them had solidified in ways words could not capture. Yet the psychological toll was evident. Fear, trauma, and the constant knowledge that death was never far behind weighed heavily on their minds. As they drifted in the currents, Holden reflected on the months of isolation, danger, and relentless struggle. The island, once a prison, had become a proving ground, testing the limits of human endurance, courage, and ingenuity.
They had survived storms, predators, disease, hunger, and the constant threat of enemy discovery. Now they faced the final challenge, the open ocean and the uncertain promise of rescue. Days passed on the raft with minimal provisions and no fresh water. Holden rationed what little they had, ensuring that every sip and bite contributed to maximum endurance. Sleep was sporadic, snatched in moments between vigilance, the threat of sharks, and the unpredictable currents never allowing full rest. The sun scorched them by day, the night brought bone-chilling cold. Yet still they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that each stroke of the oar brought them closer to freedom. Then came the storm, a monstrous typhoon that tested every ounce of skill and will. Waves towered above the men, the wind tore at their raft, and rain lashed like needles. For hours they clung to life, shouting above the roar of the sea, steering with desperate precision. Holden's hands were raw, bloodied from the strain, but he refused to let go. Daniels guided the craft, Briggs watched for floating debris, and the remaining men worked in tandem to stabilize the vessel. Survival was no longer merely a hope, it was a battle against the elements themselves. When the storm passed, the men were physically broken, but alive. On the horizon, a shape emerged, a vessel, unmistakably allied. With every remaining ounce of energy, they signaled, shouting, waving, and using reflective surfaces to catch the attention of the crew. Minutes stretched like hours, and then finally, the ship altered course, approaching them. Relief and exhaustion mingled in overwhelming waves. They had survived the unforgotten island, endured what seemed impossible, and now faced the prospect of return to the world that had long since written them off. The rescue was bittersweet. Holden and his men left the island behind, its dense jungle swallowing their tracks, hiding the trials and suffering they had endured. Each step onto the deck of the Allied vessel was a step back into life. Yet the memories of the island, the fear, and the camaraderie forged in isolation would remain indelibly imprinted on their minds. The men were debriefed, their story recorded in military archives, yet the world remained largely unaware of the island and the ordeal endured there. The soldiers became living legends among their comrades, the tale of endurance, ingenuity, and courage spreading quietly, whispered among those who understood the stakes of survival behind enemy lines. By the time they reached a proper military base, Holden understood that the war would continue, but they had won a private battle, a triumph of human spirit over adversity, isolation, and the relentless cruelty of both nature and war. Their survival would be remembered in hushed tones, a story of resilience and an enduring testament to the will to live against overwhelming odds.
The survivors returned to military life, yet reintegration was complicated. Physically, they bore the scars of malnutrition, disease, and exposure. Mentally, the island had etched permanent marks, hypervigilance, nightmares, and a profound understanding of life's fragility. Each man struggled with the mundane details of normal existence. Cities, crowds, and noise were foreign after months of absolute isolation. Holden, Briggs, Daniels, and the remaining men underwent medical evaluations. Doctors were astounded by their survival, noting weakened muscles, severe dehydration, and early signs of tropical diseases. Psychological assessments revealed stress responses consistent with prolonged combat and isolation, symptoms now recognized as post-traumatic stress. Counseling was minimal, as the military's understanding of such conditions was limited, leaving the men to navigate their trauma largely on their own. Yet, amid the hardship of reintegration, they shared their story with officers and fellow soldiers. Debriefings recounted survival techniques, enemy patrol encounters, and the improvisation necessary to endure. The information proved invaluable for planning future operations, survival training, and understanding the environment in which Allied soldiers might be stranded. Their ordeal became a case study in resilience, adaptability, and the extremities of human endurance. The world, however, largely remained unaware. Newspapers printed occasional notices of missing soldiers, yet the full tale of the forgotten island was classified for decades. Families waited,
Letters arrived too late, and the island itself became a place of legend among those who knew. Holden kept a personal journal, recording details too sensitive for official reports, the fears, the dreams, and the camaraderie that had kept them alive. Time passed. The men aged, their bodies healed, but their memories persistent. They reunited in small groups on anniversaries, sharing reflections, acknowledging losses, and honoring the comrades who had not survived. The forgotten island remained a silent specter in their lives, a place of horror, beauty, and profound human achievement. Eventually, the military released portions of the story. Articles appeared, interviews recorded, and the men shared experiences in lectures and historical retrospectives. The island became a symbol of survival and courage, of soldiers left behind and refusing to yield, of human will tested by nature and war alike. Holden often revisited the images in his mind: the endless jungle, the crashing waves, the storms that threatened to swallow them, the faces of his comrades, and the quiet moments of camaraderie that sustained them. These memories, vivid and unshakable, became both a burden and a treasure, a testament to the limits of endurance and the capacity of the human spirit. The Forgotten Island's legacy endures. It is remembered in historical texts, whispered in military academies, and preserved in the memories of those who survived. Holden and his comrades became living witnesses to the extremes of war, examples of ingenuity, resilience, and the refusal to surrender even when the world had written them off. Their story stands as a reminder. Even in the most isolated, desperate circumstances, human courage and determination can carve a path through the seemingly impossible.